Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you the technique used to draw this giraffe. Giraffes have a bit of a weird texture as it's neither fur nor skin, it's kind of somewhere in between, and it can be a little bit difficult to render this texture in coloured pencil. Before we get into this tutorial, take a look in the description of the video and you'll find a link to my free Facebook group where you're invited to share your art, get feedback on your drawings and talk to other like-minded artists. I'm in there most days posting tips, videos and chatting to you guys, so pop on over and join the family. Let's get started on the giraffe. One of the important features of the giraffe when it comes to the face is the eyes. They're kind of like camels with these long floaty eyelashes, and it's really important that you get those in, as well as those big dark almost sort of like protruding eyes. The eyelashes you can add in a number of ways depending on your reference photo. If your eyelashes are really bright and white, then you can use an embossing tool to indent the paper before you begin, so you're left with nice clean grooves in the paper, and you can etch layers of pigment away after you've added the dark eyes with something like a scalpel. Or you can use a white pencil like I did with this one. The eyelashes on my reference weren't too pronounced, so I thought the white pencil would work best in this case because it's kind of like a soft, subtle white overlay. The rest of the eyes are pretty simple. Most giraffes have pretty dark eyes, and if your particular reference does have like really dark, almost black eyes, make sure that you do add some brown tones in there because giraffes do have like little flashes of brown. They're not completely black, so make sure you add some brown tones to those darker colours to create some kind of depth there. Now the skin is where it's at, and it's not as hard as you might think. The most effective method I've found for portraying this kind of texture is to use a lot of shading, and I mean a lot. As always, you want to work from light to dark with your coloured pencils, and you want to work in the direction, if there is any, of the very soft fuzz on the skin. I like to use a warm grey 1 as a base and gently use this all over using a very light pressure and making sure to keep the tone even. The next step in making the skin is to add in those distinct markings. I like to add a soft layer of burnt ochre before going over with a burnt sienna pencil. The combination of that light and that sort of dark orange-red tone is perfect, and by using a lighter base, you get that shining through some of the darker top layers, and this starts to add depth to the colour. Now, you could go straight into using burnt sienna and go straight on dark, but in my opinion you end up with quite flat looking areas when you do it that way. Building up your lighter colours not only adds that depth, but it also fills the tooth of the paper and works like a bit like a natural blender as you get into your darker layers. Once all the spots and markings are down in the area that I'm working on, I can then start to shade and add a little bit of structure to the face. I find a warm grey 3, a light flesh and a walnut brown pencil work a treat together at defining some of the more shadowy areas. Giraffe skin doesn't actually require too many layers, especially in the lighter toned areas, so you really need to pay attention to your shadows, to the form and bone structure of the face and any light directions so that you can get those shadows and that bone structure as accurate as possible, because that is essentially what makes up the giraffe. When adding these shadows down and using those darker colours, you want to keep the same motion and pressure as your previous base layers. So you're going to want to continue using a shading method, and you want to hold your pencil almost like horizontal to the paper and gently sweep the pencil back and forth. This keeps the pressure even and means that you're less likely to create hard lines which can detract from the realistic look. The lighter areas of a giraffe are similar to a white or even a cream toned fur, and I like to add in a little bit of sky blue into those areas to create an even lighter appearance. This works great, especially when you're kind of pairing it with a cream, so you could pair warm grey 1 and cream and sky blue to create a really nice light toned area. Once those highlights and shadows are a little bit more defined, then you can go ahead and darken some of the spots with a little bit more burnt sienna and maybe even a little bit of walnut brown as well. There's a lot of skin on this giraffe, and this is a process I follow throughout the whole thing, just using that gentle shading motion. You'll notice that I'm not putting in any sort of distinct fur details, and that's because adding in tiny little fur strokes would make the giraffe either look really wiry or way too fluffy. So I found that it's just best to stick with shading until you get to some hairier parts like the ossicones or the horns. The ears, you kind of want to treat in a similar way to the eyes. They've got those long fluffy sections overhanging like this dark middle, so you can use the same kind of method here as you did with the eyelashes, or depending on how pronounced and bright those white sort of fluffy bits are, use a method which replicates that. So for instance, if your fluffy ears are quite muted and blended into the rest of the ear, you don't particularly want to use an embossing tool to create deep, bright lines. So instead you'll want to use something like a white pencil or a kneaded eraser to lift some pigment away. The method I used on my portrait here was actually a negative space method. So to do that, I added the surrounding ear texture, so all of that shading around the ear, and I left the sort of lighter chunks bare, so I left the paper white showing before it was time to add that texture in. And to add that texture, I used a dark pencil and worked in the opposite direction of the way the fluff was going. And I created little separations between each hair strand, gradually lifting the pencil towards the end and base of the fluff to blend it in. This takes a little bit of practice, and it's kind of the same technique as drawing fur lines. So if that's something that you struggle with, then hop on over and watch my fur tutorials to learn how to do that. I then shaded lightly over all of those light areas and the little dark strands that I've added to blend everything together, and I added in a few more pronounced lines in between just to create a few more sort of distinct whiter strands. Ossicones, or the horns of the giraffe, are where we see some texture creeping in. So I start off that with the same shaded base and application of the skin, working from light to sort of midtones and dark, but working towards the tips of those horns I start to build in some fur strokes. So I start to add in these fur strokes when adding in the midtones, so using a soft orange like the burnt ochre. I also add in shorter lines coming back towards sort of the base of the ossicones and coming back into the face skin, and eventually coming back into complete shading so that everything sort of blends smoothly from like shaded all the way up the horns to where you've got these more sort of furry textures. So it's not just skin 1 minute and then fur all of a sudden. You need to lengthen your fur strokes as you work up the horns and into any kind of furry areas. You want to keep doing this over and over, gradually getting darker with your coloured pencils until you've reached your last dark colour and you're just adding in the very darkest shadows. Throughout the front of the face, there's often this kind of flecked appearance on the fur, and to get that effect, what you need to do is leave large gaps in between your darker fur strokes. So you've got those lighter colours down and added fur strokes quite close together to get that tone. So with your darker strokes, you want to get further and further apart so that you have gaps of this lighter tone showing through. The rest of the process for the rest of the face is then just about continuing the shading, getting in the shadows and developing tones like we did in the beginning around the eye. You want to look at your reference for any areas that do have more texture and use those little fur lines to add in a bit more of the furry look. I think the neck is probably the easiest part, as that almost has no texture and it just requires a whole bunch of shading, which can be quite therapeutic. Now if you're drawing your own giraffe, it really is just like a kind of big practice and sort of process of just shading. You want to really limit the amount of texture that you put down. You don't want to go too crazy with texture. As I said, it will end up looking too fluffy or too wiry. So you just want to add in a lot of shading just to get kind of like that smooth kind of skin texture. But you don't want to end up like really burnishing your portrait so that you end up with a really smooth look. I find that leaving the grain of the paper here is kind of the best thing to do because it kind of gives you that kind of soft skin, almost like a very slight wrinkled effect. So don't go too heavy with a burnisher or a blender. Don't push too heavy with your pencils either, otherwise you're just going to smooth everything out and it will just kind of look like human skin, where it's really nice and smooth and silky. You kind of want to have a little bit of texture, so I find that the paper texture showing through helps with that. So that's pretty much it for the YouTube version of this, but if you do want to follow along with this tutorial in real time, then you can do so over on my Patreon page or by subscribing to my website tutorials. If you take a look at my website, you'll see all of the tutorials that I have on offer, as well as a little peek into what the tutorial layout is like. You can also pick up a free tiger eye lesson with the link in the description if you want to grow your skills some more and learn some more about fur. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial and can apply some of the methods I've talked about here to your own work. Not necessarily a giraffe, but if you have something like of a similar texture, then hopefully this will help you. The methods that I've explained here will help you to create those. I really love seeing your work as well, so make sure that you share it with me either in my Facebook group with the link below or over on my Instagram page. I always look at everybody's work and I always give them a nice like as well. If you're new here and you want to see where your coloured pencil journey takes you further, then hit that subscribe button and tick the bell so that you never miss an upload. I post new videos every single Friday for you guys. That's it for today. I will see you guys next week. Bye!